History often remembers the loud moments of a tragedy. But in reality, the end begins with silence. It begins with the quiet turning of a page. It begins on a frozen night in Virginia. Richmond is a city defined by its deep rivers. It is a place where history lives in the brickwork. But in the winter of 2014, the residents of the South Side were not thinking of history. They were thinking only of the biting cold. The night of January 31st was unforgiving. Temperatures had plummeted well below the freezing point. A sharp wind whipped off the James River. It cut through the streets with a physical force. It drove families behind locked doors and drawn curtains. The world outside felt brittle and dangerously sharp. Under the amber glow of the streetlights, the neighborhood of Mandalay Drive sat in absolute stillness. It was 1:30 in the morning, a time when the city should have been sleeping. But on the 2200 block, something was awake. A silver sedan was parked in a driveway. It was backed in, facing the empty street. The engine was running, humming a low, steady rhythm. White clouds of exhaust puffed into the freezing air. To a casual observer, it looked ordinary enough. Perhaps someone was warming the car before a drive. Perhaps they were waiting for a passenger to emerge. But minutes turned into an hour, and nothing moved. The windows were fogged over with thick condensation. Inside that vehicle, time had stopped completely. A neighbor named Dormita Moore stepped outside briefly. The cold air hit her face, waking her senses. She noticed the car running in the driveway. She noticed the lack of movement inside the cabin. Driven by an instinct she could not name, she walked across the frost-covered lawn to check. She wiped a small circle on the passenger window. She leaned in to look through the glass. And in that moment, the silence of Richmond shattered. Inside the car, slumped quietly in the passenger seat, sat a young woman who appeared to be resting. She was dressed for a night out. She looked peaceful in the dim light of the dashboard. But she was not sleeping. Her name was Khadijah Stewart. She was only 19 years old. And she was the tragic center of a story that had been spiraling toward this moment for years. The authorities were called to the scene immediately. Blue lights cut through the darkness of the street. They illuminated the frost on the pavement. They illuminated the tragic stillness inside the vehicle. Khadijah Stewart had been found. But the story of how she arrived there was not a mystery of random street violence. It was not a case of being in the wrong place. It was a tragedy of intimacy and trust. It was the final chapter of a complicated love. And it began long before that winter night. To understand the loss that occurred that night, we must first understand the life that was lived. Khadijah Stewart was not built for a tragic ending. She was a young woman built for ambition. She was born in March of 1994. She grew up navigating the complex ecosystem of Richmond. It is a city of stark duality and contrast. There is the beauty of the historic districts. And there are the harder edges of the city blocks. Khadijah learned early how to walk in both worlds. Those who knew her best described a radiant personality. She possessed a smile that could disarm a room. It was wide, genuine, and completely infectious. She was the friend who always remembered details. She was the daughter who called just to check in. But she was not naive or fragile. You do not grow up in this city without resilience. Khadijah was fierce when she needed to be. She had a stubborn streak that served her well. She demanded respect from the people around her. By 19, she had already achieved significant milestones. She had graduated high school with an advanced diploma. She had secured a job with a government contractor. It was a position that promised real stability. It offered a legitimate path forward in life. Her mother had worked hard to protect this future. Years earlier, sensing the gravitational pull of the city, her mother moved the family to Chesterfield County. Chesterfield was quiet, safe, and manicured. It was a world of silent nights and green lawns. It was supposed to be a fortress for Khadijah. And on paper, the move was a complete success. Khadijah thrived in the safety of the suburbs. She was independent, hardworking, and focused. She was standing on the precipice of adulthood. But geography cannot sever an emotional tether. You can take the girl out of the city, but you cannot easily take the city out of the girl. Khadijah's body lived in the safety of Chesterfield, but her heart was still held in the South Side. She was drawn back to the familiar streets. She was drawn back to the community she knew. And most dangerously, she was drawn back to a bond. A bond that felt like love, but looked like control. A bond with a man named Lionel Carter. Lionel Carter was 4 years older than Khadijah. At that young age, 4 years is a lifetime. He was a figure of authority in her world. He cut an imposing figure on the street. Standing tall, with broad shoulders and a confident walk, Lionel moved with the heavy certainty of a man who rarely heard the word no from anyone. He was not looking for a corporate job. He was deeply embedded in the local culture. He was affiliated with a group from the Blackwell area. To a teenage Khadijah, Lionel was intoxicating. He represented a different kind of safety. He offered protection in a world that felt chaotic. He offered status among her peers in the city. And Lionel didn't just love Khadijah. He was fixated on her. In the early days, it looked like romance. It looked like the kind of passion seen in films. He brought her gifts and charmed her family. He stood by her side like a dedicated guardian. But possessiveness often disguises itself as protection. Lionel wanted the world to know she was his. In a gesture he claimed was ultimate devotion, Lionel made a permanent mark on his own skin. He had her first name inked on his arm. It was written in bold, unmistakable letters. At the time, Khadijah thought it was beautiful. She saw it as a promise written in ink. But looking back, it was not a promise. It was a statement of ownership. It was Lionel telling every other man in Richmond that this person had been claimed by him. Their relationship became a volatile weather system. There were arguments that shook the walls, followed by days of intense reconciliation. Khadijah tried to leave him several times. She would retreat to the safety of Chesterfield. She would focus on her job and her future. But Lionel always found a way back in. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to press. He was the familiar chaos in her organized life. And despite the tension and the disagreements, they maintained a bond that seemed unbreakable, until the day the past walked back through the door, and the balance of power began to shift. January of 2014 brought a shift in the wind. A figure from Khadijah's childhood returned to Richmond. His name was Tommy Coleman. Years before Lionel, before the intensity and the drama, there had been Tommy. He was Khadijah's middle school sweetheart. He was her first innocent crush. They had shared a time before life became complicated. But the streets of Richmond can interrupt childhood. Tommy had been sent away as a juvenile. He spent his formative years in a detention facility. The innocent romance was cut short by separation. For years, he was just a memory to Khadijah. He was a what-if that faded with time. But in early 2014, Tommy was released. He returned to the city a free young man. And the first thing he did was look for her. He looked for the girl with the bright smile. When Khadijah saw Tommy again, something woke up. It wasn't just nostalgia for the past. It was hope for a different kind of future. Tommy represented a time before the toxicity. He represented a fresh start and simple affection. They reconnected almost instantly. Khadijah, usually careful, let her guard down. She was happy in a way she hadn't been. She started posting photos of them on social media. Images of two young people rediscovering each other. Captions filled with happiness and optimism. It was the excitement of a second chance. But she did not realize the danger of visibility. With every photo she posted online, she was broadcasting her happiness to the wrong audience. Lionel Carter was watching everything from a distance. He saw the photos on his feed. He heard the whispers in the neighborhood. He was being replaced by another man. And not just any man, but someone from uptown. In Richmond, Uptown and Blackwell were rival territories. This was not just a romantic breakup. In Lionel's mind, this was a challenge to his status. It was a public humiliation he could not accept. He felt his control slipping away. And a man like Lionel does not let go easily. He began a campaign of psychological pressure. He didn't just call her phone incessantly. He hunted her in the digital space. He took private moments they had shared, and he threatened to expose them to the world. He wanted to shame her into submission. He wanted to strip her of her dignity. He wanted to ensure no other man would look at her. It was a cruel and calculated move. But Khadijah had that resilience in her blood. She tried to brush it off. She told her friends he was just acting out. She believed his words were empty threats. She believed their history would protect her. She believed she could manage the situation. She was wrong. Psychological pressure was only the beginning of the campaign. Posting photos online was a way to exact shame. But shaming her did not bring her back to him. It only pushed her further away from his grasp. Lionel needed to escalate his tactics of control. He needed to make his presence felt in reality. He needed Khadijah to know she was never truly safe. One morning, Khadijah walked out to her vehicle. She was ready for another day of work. She was ready to leave the drama behind her. But when she reached the driveway, she stopped cold. The car sat low and uneven on the pavement. The rubber of her tires had been destroyed intentionally. It was not a random act of vandalism. It was a message delivered with sharp precision. It was a silent statement of restriction and power. You think you can drive away from me? You cannot go anywhere without my permission. It was a violent warning to stay put. Her friends saw the damage and were terrified. They begged her to see the reality of the danger. He is losing control, Khadijah, they warned her. This is not just jealousy, this is stalking. You need to stay away from him completely. But Khadijah had that resilience in her blood. She refused to be intimidated by a damaged car. She tried to rationalize the violence of the act. He is just hurting, she told her worried friends. He acts out because he knows I am leaving. She believed she understood the language of the streets. She believed his actions were a cry for attention. She did not see the tires as a threat. She saw them as a tantrum of a broken heart. She fixed the car and she kept moving forward. She kept seeing Tommy Coleman on the side. But Lionel was not just hurting, as she thought. He was unraveling at the seams of his sanity. Every photo she posted was an insult to him. Every day she didn't call him was a betrayal. The pressure inside him was building to a break. He began calling her phone incessantly at all hours. If she didn't answer, he would call her friends. He would call her family members looking for her. He was tightening the net around her life. He was making her world smaller and smaller. And Khadijah, brave as she was, began to tire. Fighting a war on two fronts is exhausting. She just wanted peace, but peace was not an option. Not in the winter of 2014. Not with a shadow watching her every move. It was the night of January 30th. The day before the silence would fall forever. Khadijah was seeking refuge from the winter storm. She was staying at the home of her friend. The house was supposed to be a safe harbor. Inside, the home was warm and full of life. Her friend's mother, a woman named Barbara Murray, was there. It was late, approaching the midnight hour. The wind was howling outside the frosted windows. But inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. At 11:50 p.m., the house grew suddenly quiet. Then, shouting erupted from the living room area. It was not the sound of two people arguing. It was the sound of one voice, distorted and loud. Khadijah was holding her cell phone in her hand. Her phone was broken and stuck on speaker mode. Every word the caller said was broadcast to the room. Barbara Murray could hear every syllable of the rage. The man on the other end was Lionel Carter. And he was no longer just angry or jealous. He sounded unhinged, dangerous, and completely out of control. He knew she was with Tommy earlier that day. He knew he was losing the battle for her heart. His voice cracked with a jagged, cold fury. "Stop playing with me, Lino," Khadijah said tiredly. She sounded exhausted, like a parent scolding a child. She was trying to de-escalate the situation with words. But Lionel was past the point of negotiation. He screamed back through the tiny phone speaker. He issued a demand that froze the room. And then came the words that would haunt Barbara. The words that turned a breakup into a homicide. He made a specific, lethal promise to her. "I will end you," was the sentiment he conveyed. The air in the living room seemed to freeze. This was not a figure of speech or metaphor. This was a specific, actionable promise of violence. Barbara Murray felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at the 19-year-old girl standing there. She saw the fear finally flicker in Khadijah's eyes. Barbara grabbed Khadijah by the arm, pleading with her. "Do not go out there, baby," Barbara begged. "You heard what he just said to you. He is not playing games tonight, Khadijah. Stay here with us where it is safe." But Khadijah stood at the crossroads of her life. Perhaps she thought she could talk him down again. Perhaps she thought she needed to end it face to face. Or perhaps she simply didn't believe he could do it. She walked toward the door and opened it. The psychology of a victim is often misunderstood. Why do they go back to the danger? Why do they walk into the fire willingly? Often, it is because they believe they are the water. Khadijah believed she was the only one who could fix him. She picked up her car keys from the table. She looked at Barbara and offered a weak smile. "I'll be right back," she might have said. Or maybe she said nothing at all to her. She walked out of the warmth of the house. She stepped into the freezing darkness of the night. The wind hit her face, stinging her skin. She got into her car and started the engine. She drove toward the Mandalay Drive neighborhood. She was driving toward a meeting with destiny. She was not meeting a stranger in an alley. She was meeting a man she had loved for years. A man who had sat at her family's table. A man who wore her name on his skin. It is hard to fear someone you have held. She arrived at the 2200 block of Mandalay. The street was deserted and dark at midnight. She saw the silver sedan waiting for her there. It belonged to Lionel's mother, a car she knew well. She parked her own car and stepped out. She walked toward the silver sedan in the cold. She opened the passenger door and slid inside. The interior was warm, the heater blasting hot air. She closed the door, sealing herself in with him. Sealing herself in with the man who had threatened her. We can only imagine the conversation that followed. Did he scream at her one last time? Did he beg her to take him back again? Did she tell him it was finally over? Did she tell him she chose Tommy Coleman? We will never know the exact words spoken. But we know that the argument did not last long. Within minutes of her entering that warm car, the potential of a bright future was extinguished. Lionel Carter made his final, fatal choice. He raised a weapon in the small space. He did not act from outside the car. He did not act from a distance away. He was sitting inches away from her face. And he ended the argument with absolute finality. The sound of the incident was swallowed by winter. On a cold night, windows are closed tight. The wind howls and masks the noises outside. On Mandalay Drive, no one reported hearing the disturbance. Or perhaps they heard it and chose to ignore. In the South Side, people learned to mind their business. A loud noise could be a car backfiring. It could be a remnant of the city's industry. And so, the silence returned almost immediately. Inside the car, the violence was over in seconds. Khadijah Stewart slumped against the passenger seat. Her hand was raised, a final defensive gesture. A futile attempt to stop the inevitable tragedy. Lionel Carter sat in the driver's seat next to her. The reality of his action filled the small cabin. He looked at the girl he claimed to love. He looked at the girl he wanted to own. And in that moment, he did not call for help. He did not try to save her life. He did not scream for the neighbors to assist. He opened the driver's side door and stepped out. The cold air rushed into the warm car. He left the engine running to keep the heat on. He left the car in park in the driveway. And he walked away into the dark night. He left her there alone in the driveway. He vanished into the shadows of the city. He became a ghost in the wind. For 2 hours, the car sat there idling. For 2 hours, the exhaust puffed white clouds. Until 1:30 in the morning, when Dormita Moore walked out. Until the police lights cut through the dark. Until the reality of the night was discovered. A life of promise was gone forever. And the hunt for Lionel Carter had begun. Detectives arrived to a confusing and chaotic scene. A young woman deceased in a running car.
No suspect, no weapon, no immediate witnesses.
Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it a random act of gang violence? But then they looked at the registration. The car belonged to the mother of Lionel Carter. And they remembered the name from the reports. The boyfriend with the damaged tires. The boyfriend with a history of control. The pieces began to fall into place quickly. But catching a ghost is never an easy task. Lionel was already running hard and fast. He was heading south, away from the crime. Away from the girl he left in the cold. In the frozen hours before dawn broke, detectives began the meticulous work of solving a puzzle. A homicide investigation is often a process of elimination. You start with the people closest to the victim. You look for motive, opportunity, and inconsistencies. The silver sedan itself was the first loud clue. It belonged to the mother of Lionel Carter. This immediately placed Lionel at the center of the frame. But detectives had to be thorough and precise. They looked first at Tommy Coleman, the new boyfriend. He had argued with Khadijah earlier that day. Jealousy is a powerful motive for a young man. Police brought Tommy in for questioning almost immediately. He was cooperative, heartbroken, and open with them. He admitted to the argument they had over Lionel. But he had an alibi that was ironclad. Cell phone records placed him miles away from Mandalay Drive. He was at a recording studio at the time. Witnesses confirmed he never left the building that night. Tommy Coleman was ruled out as a person of interest. Detectives then turned their attention to Callie Bennett. Callie was Lionel's current girlfriend on the side. She had been spotted at the crime scene crying. Was she a jealous rival who snapped that night? She admitted she knew Lionel was unfaithful to her. She admitted she had seen the photos online. But her alibi also held up under scrutiny. She was at her aunt's house when the incident occurred. This left only one person standing in the spotlight. The man who had threatened to end Khadijah's life. The man whose mother owned the silver sedan. Lionel Carter was the only piece that fit the puzzle. But Lionel Carter was nowhere to be found. His phone was turned off or discarded completely. His social media accounts went silent for days. He had vanished into the vastness of the South. His family began to spin a different narrative to police. They claimed Lionel was running because he was scared. They told police it was a hit by rivals. They claimed enemies were targeting Lionel and killed Khadijah. They painted a picture of a tragic crossfire. But detectives were not buying the story of gang warfare. Targeted hits are usually loud and messy affairs. This was intimate, quiet, and confined to a car. This was personal violence, not territorial warfare. The hunt for Lionel Carter expanded nationwide. Detectives knew that a man on the run makes mistakes. They knew that fear makes people careless. They waited for him to surface. Running from the law is difficult in modern times. Digital footprints are hard to erase completely. Lionel Carter managed to stay hidden for 2 weeks. He fled 500 miles south of Richmond. He ended up in the state of Georgia. And he did not go alone on this run. Callie Bennett, the innocent girlfriend, went with him. They were hiding in plain sight in the city of Decatur. But even ghosts make mistakes eventually. On February 16th, a police officer spotted them. They were loitering in an area known for transients. The officer approached them to ask for identification. Lionel Carter, tired of running or perhaps arrogant, gave his real name to the officer on duty. The system flagged him immediately as a fugitive. He was arrested and brought back to Virginia. During the ride back, and in the interrogation room, Lionel maintained a wall of absolute silence. He refused to confess to the crime. He refused to show remorse for the loss of Khadijah. He sat stone-faced, staring at the detectives across the table. But on social media, he had been active while running. He posted messages of grief for the world to see. "My heart is broken. I love you." It was a performance for an invisible audience. Public grieving is often a mask for private guilt. The Commonwealth of Virginia began to build their case. They had the threat heard by Barbara Murray. They had the damaged tires from weeks before. They had the car ownership and the flight to Georgia. But they did not have a weapon. They did not have DNA evidence on the trigger. They did not have an eyewitness to the shooting itself. The case would rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. And in a courtroom, circumstantial evidence can be risky. The trial began in October of 2015. It was a spectacle of high tension in Richmond. 2 families sat on opposite sides of the aisle, divided by grief, anger, and the search for truth. The prosecution laid out the timeline of control. They painted Lionel as a possessive, jealous ex-boyfriend. But the defense had a surprise strategy ready. They decided to put Lionel Carter on the stand. They let the accused man tell his own story. It was a gamble that rarely pays off. Lionel Carter took the oath and sat down. He looked at the jury with a steady gaze. He told a story that sounded like a film script. He claimed he was in the car with Khadijah. He claimed they were just talking peacefully that night. "We were working things out," he told the court. Then, he introduced a phantom vehicle to the story. He claimed a car full of rivals pulled up. He said Khadijah saw them and screamed at him, "Run, Lino, run. Save yourself." She supposedly yelled. He told the jury he bolted from the car. He left Khadijah alone in the passenger seat. He claimed he heard shots as he sprinted away. He said he ran into the darkness to hide. He admitted to leaving her there to face them alone. When the prosecutor asked why he didn't call 911, Lionel leaned back and played a dangerous card. "As someone from the streets," he said without flinching, "you don't call the police. You handle business yourself." He claimed a code of silence kept him from helping. He tried to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, a tortured soul bound by loyalty to the streets. He wanted the jury to see a tragedy, but the jury looked at him and saw cowardice. Even in his own lie, he abandoned her. He admitted to running away while she was in danger. He admitted to fleeing the state afterwards. His story had holes that the evidence filled quickly. Forensic experts took the stand to rebut him. They pointed to the physical reality of the car. There were no impact marks on the outside of the car. If rivals pulled up and fired, glass would shatter inwards. The car's exterior was pristine and untouched. The action had happened inside the vehicle. The person responsible was sitting in the driver's seat. The angle of the injuries confirmed close range. Khadijah had a defensive wound on her hand. She had raised her palm to stop the inevitable. She saw the threat coming from inside the car. She was looking at the person who ended her life. Lionel's story crumbled under the weight of physics. The jury saw through the facade of the code. They saw a man trying to talk his way out. They saw a man who thought he could outsmart them. They began their deliberations on October 8th. It did not take long for justice to arrive. The jury deliberated for only 45 minutes. They returned to the courtroom with a verdict. Lionel Carter stood up to hear his fate. Guilty. Second-degree murder. He showed no emotion as the word was read. No tears for the girl he claimed to love. No remorse for the future he had stolen. Just the cold stare of a man who lost control. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison. Khadijah Stewart was 19 years old. She had done the hard work to escape. She had the diploma, the job, the ambition. She tried to walk away from the toxicity, but the past is a heavy thing to carry. Toxic love is a sticky web to untangle. Her mother still talks to her every day. She listens for her laugh in the quiet moments. She remembers the sugar and spice of her daughter. But memory is a poor substitute for a life. This story serves as a haunting reminder to us. It is a warning about control disguised as passion. It is a lesson that history is not a shield. And it is a testament to the power of intuition. When someone tells you exactly who they are, when they threaten you in a moment of rage, when they shame you to keep you close, you must believe them the first time. Love protects. Love nurtures. Love sets you free. Love does not threaten to end your life. In the end, Lionel Carter lost everything. He didn't lose Khadijah to a rival group. He lost her to his own fragile, violent ego. And the world lost a bright, shining light to the cold, indifferent darkness of a Richmond winter.